If you are afflicted with stage 4 internet brain rot like many of us, and you're even minorly in tune with the Legend of Zelda community on the internet, you've undoubtedly seen the conversation around the deficiencies in Tears of the Kingdom's story. Particularly on Twitter, there's been an element of this discourse that has been driving me up the wall. Tears of the Kingdom has a lot of fans, and many of them are eager to defend the title from criticism, but the way they're doing it is very dumb. The common defense of Tears of the Kingdom having a flawed story has largely been, so what? Zelda games have always had bad stories. And this isn't just some minority opinion I dug up to have something to get angry about. If you look at the replies to just about any tweet or video criticizing the story of Tears of the Kingdom, you'll see that this sort of defense is extremely common. And it's complete nonsense. It's a very silly, dumb thing to say. If I'm being charitable towards those levying these sorts of statements, I imagine that many of them are not fans of the Zelda series as a whole, but they're more specifically fans of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and know about the rest of the series through a general cultural osmosis. That's really the only explanation that makes sense to me, because I'd assume that anybody with even the lightest actual experience with the franchise in its totality would not be able to say Zelda games have a bad story and keep a straight face. The truth is that Zelda stories are usually pretty dang good, occasionally dip into excellence, and on one occasion have broached into peak fiction. So I'd like to offer a rebuttal to the idea that Zelda games tend to have bad stories by offering some examples of excellent Zelda storytelling, and I brought a few friends to help. But before I spend 5 minutes ego-stroking Majora's Mask fans, I think it's worth considering where this idea comes from. Naturally, part of it is just that it's always popular to pretend the newest Zelda game actually sucks, and hot take culture in general is very strong these days. But I think it goes a bit deeper too. Like I said, I think much of this discourse likely comes from people who are primarily fans of the open air or Switch era of games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, as opposed to fans of the series as a whole. Sort of like the many people who adore Resident Evil 4, calling it one of their favorite games of all time, but never really explore the rest of the Resident Evil series. There's nothing wrong with only liking 1 or 2 games in a series, but I probably won't trust a value judgment offered by you that relates to the series as a whole.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
In many cases, I think these people see the modern cinematic way in which stories are told in Breath of the Wild, with voice acting and cutscenes delivered by means other than a text box. Then they look at the more stilted means in which stories of Zelda games past are delivered, and just sort of assume that Breath of the Wild is where the story actually starts to matter. This is certainly an incorrect thing to say, and us longtime Zelda fans find it kind of humorous, since one of our big complaints about Breath of the Wild is its lack of story, but I can understand where they're coming from. The second factor, I think, comes from a reputation the series has for putting story second in terms of game design philosophy. And this is not something invented in the minds of newer fans, this is the truth. Miyamoto and Aonuma have time and time again drilled down on the idea that they start each Zelda game with a gameplay idea first and come up with the story later. It is undeniable truth to say that the Zelda team does indeed care more about gameplay than they do story, but I think way too many people take this admission and stretch it well past the point where it makes sense. Caring about gameplay more doesn't mean they don't care about the story at all. And you can see examples of Aonuma putting a great deal of thought into the stories by basing them on feelings from his personal life, like his personal trauma influencing Majora's Mask, or his feelings towards fatherhood directing the writing in Wind Waker. One of the things that's always impressed me about the Zelda series is the fact that it has such consistently good storytelling, despite that not being the primary focus. The last factor in this bizarre opinion, I think, is just the era of gaming that we happen to be living in. We live in an age where more and more games every year come out with heavier and heavier focuses on story, with people outside the industry even getting involved, and industry figures like David Cage basing their career entirely around story-oriented games. So naturally, if you compare a Zelda game to one of these heavily story-based games, at first glance it might seem like Zelda games do actually have bad stories, but I think it would be a big mistake to make that connection. I don't think that the amount of cutscenes has a correlation with the quality of the story. I'll be honest with you, I think that Majora's Mask has a much better story than Heavy Rain.
Jason!
So ultimately, you have this perfect trifecta of factors leading to the idea that Zelda games have bad stories. You have new fans who sort of wave off the potential of the previous games without really trying them. You have the proliferation of the idea that the Zelda team themselves don't care about the story. And then you have the fact that Zelda games in the modern day are situated between many games that have an entire focus on telling a good story. If you are to combine all of these factors, suddenly it becomes at the very least understandable as to why people might be led to make these crazy claims like Zelda games have never had good stories. But again, it's total and complete nonsense. If you were to make this claim in like 1992, when the only games to exist were the NES titles and A Link to the Past, maybe you'd be onto something. But as early as 1993, with the release of Link's Awakening, the Zelda series has been telling excellent stories. A criticism I often hear, even from Zelda fans, is that the Zelda series is full of pretty basic Joseph Campbell-esque hero's journey storylines. I think this is basically true, but it drives me up the wall when people use the hero's journey cycle as some sort of criticism in itself, since the Zelda team shares some pretty good company in that regard, with the likes of the works of Homer being used as literary examples by Campbell. Simply pointing out that a story adheres to the hero's cycle is not any sort of meaningful criticism in itself. As time has gone by, the very idea of the hero's cycle as a format has come under a lot of criticism, and even then, a story that adheres to the cycle can still be excellent, as we've seen time and time again. And we very much see this in Ocarina of Time, which I think is a marvel of storytelling. The plot certainly isn't sophisticated if you hold it up against the likes of The Last of Us or rebooted God of War, but if you look at it with the context of its time period, the truth is quickly revealed. Ocarina of Time was an action game telling a complete, engaging, and meaningful story in 1998, a time where the only place you were really going to find such a thing was in an RPG or a PC adventure game, and it managed to accomplish this task while also juggling the job of bringing the Legend of Zelda series, and in many ways 3D adventure games in general, into the 3D era. Ocarina of Time managed to do this by being a master of subtlety, by being able to communicate a lot while saying very little. There's actually a pretty great video on this topic that you've probably seen. Ocarina of Time didn't let its technology hold it back from telling a good story. It circumvented the constraints by using every tool available to it to convey mood, feeling, and atmosphere without needing to bog things down with too many text boxes or take up valuable storage space with huge amounts of voice acting. It did this with every tool it had, down to something as simple as facial expressions. While the facial expressions in Ocarina of Time might seem like a trivial area to focus on, I think they're a lot more impressive than we often give them credit for. This was not an era where facial expressions were used in a nuanced way outside of pre-rendered cutscenes.
Sorry about that. When I saw the uniform, I thought you were another zombie.
Who are you? Who are you?
They were mostly the territory of goofy cartoon-like characters such as Crash, and when they were used for the purpose of narrative, they tended to look like this.
What's up, Knuckles? Something bugging you? Something bugging you?
But the facial expressions in Ocarina of Time were kind of incredible. It shows a masterful display of the ability to show and not tell, and you can tell 1,000 words through a facial expression. I often think of a more modern example of this in The Last of Us. Moderate spoilers for the end of the game, skip like 30 seconds ahead if you need to. The Last of Us is a wordy game, one that's not afraid to both show and tell you things, and it has a number of excellent examples of telling. When two characters have opposing views and they both clearly and convincingly lay out their reasons for disagreement, it's good writing through and through, but none of that stuff really sticks with me. You know what does stick with me? The moment at the very end of the game where Ellie asks Joel if he's telling the truth, and he lies to her.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And no matter what You keep finding something to fight for.
Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
For a brief but agonizing moment, she just stares at him. No words, just a look of uncertainty. But just from this expression, we can tell what she's feeling. Somewhere deep in her gut, she knows that he's probably lying, but she loves Joel at this point and desperately wants to believe him. This conflict plays out before us in 10 seconds of wordless expression, and we don't need any dialogue to aid us in our understanding. Ellie's face says it all. That is the power of a facial expression, and this is the best moment in the entire game by my estimation. Which is why I find it so impressive that Ocarina of Time does the exact same thing in 1998 with a comparative level of success as this PS3 game in 2013. I feel the exact same way when Saria says goodbye to Link as he leaves Kokiri Forest, his home, for the first time. The protracted silence as she gives him her ocarina to remember her by, to remember home by. That awkward moment as Link slowly backs away from Saria, not wanting to leave but knowing he must. Then, just an extended shot of Saria staring, forlorn, as her dear friend leaves on an adventure that just might take his life. She could give a monologue about how she's feeling, but she doesn't need to. This simple shot, so expressive despite being so simple, tells the story for us. Again, this might not seem like a big deal, but I want to convey just how novel this was for the time. This sort of expressive storytelling is commonplace now, but it certainly was not back then. Most early 3D games struggled to render a face at all, let alone one capable of nuanced expression. Let's compare the facial expressions in Ocarina of Time to one of its peers, Metal Gear Solid, released in the same year. I think it's universally agreed upon that the first Metal Gear Solid game has an incredible story, a revolutionary one for the time, showing that games could explore mature and complicated themes, and that gamers had the stomach for it. But one thing that Metal Gear Solid is not is subtle. When a character in Metal Gear Solid feels something, you are going to hear about it for an extended period of time and probably more than once.
You're incredible. Like a movie hero or something.
No, you're wrong. In the movies, the hero always saves the girl.
You mean Meryl? Sorry. Forget I said anything.
Which kind of makes sense, right? They don't really have faces to speak of, so there isn't any way for them to convey their emotions in any way other than to just clearly communicate them. This certainly does the job, and there's some pretty memorable lines in the first Metal Gear Solid game, but it can lead to some dialogue that certainly feels clumsy at times, and often quite cheesy.
Do you think love can bloom, even on a battlefield?
And if you think that I'm cherry picking because Metal Gear Solid is somewhat infamous for having potato faces, I encourage you to look at some of the other games that came out around Ocarina of Time. Look at the faces and see if you can find any that do expressions better. Final Fantasy VII, Half-Life, even games released later like Resident Evil 3 and Harvest Moon 64 struggle to convey meanings and feeling through facial expressions. Really, this type of nuanced facial expression is mostly the realm of pre-rendered cutscenes, but things are different in Ocarina of Time. We can tell Saria is feeling a million different emotions at once simply by a slight change in her facial expression, and this sort of subtle storytelling is all throughout the game. We don't need to be told about the increasing affection between Link and Sheik. We can see it in the way that Sheik chooses to linger just a moment longer than needed before disappearing. It's obvious that Link is frightened at the royal tomb, not because he yells, "I am afraid," but because we see the terror in his eyes. Zelda does inform us of her worries regarding Ganondorf, but it's reinforced by the sadness in her face. Ocarina of Time's expressive storytelling shows up even in the small ways, like the way Link shivers and whimpers during his nightmare, or the way Navi playfully bounces around at some moments and stays deathly still at others. All of these aid in Ocarina's ability to tell an effective story in a genre that doesn't make that easy, without taking up too much time and detracting from the narrative all the way back in 1998. This is impressive no matter how you look at it. There are a lot of really great modern games with excellent stories. I just played Jedi Survivor and that story was really touching, but no moment in that game, or really many games at all, have seared their way into my memory the same way as that sorrowful, sad glance from Saria. Even if we look at the game through a modern lens, though, and ignore the innovations it brought to storytelling in the 3D action game medium, the actual story itself is pretty great. Again, Ocarina of Time often gets dismissed as being a simple hero's journey tale, but I've explained why I find that to be poor criticism, and I also think it's so much more. The actual plot of Ocarina of Time might be a pretty straightforward save the kingdom from an evil ruler storyline, but it's rich with theming and symbolism. It explores the process of growing up, it glorifies and celebrates childhood innocence and optimism, while being willing to explore the loss of that innocence and critique the limits of that optimism. Failure is a central theme and explored in a big way, as Link fails the kingdom in a way that cannot be undone. He does save the day, but the trauma inflicted on the kingdom of Hyrule will not be undone. The races of Hyrule who were tormented by Ganondorf can heal and recover, but some lasting damage will always be present. Link saves Hyrule, but he doesn't fix it because he can't. That's the princess's job, to fix her kingdom, but she cannot fix Link, or the strife he underwent in his journey. All she can do is send him back to his childhood one last time to return the years that were stolen from him. But while the motivation for this was kind-hearted, she sent him back to his childhood body with the memories and trauma of an adult, to a world where nobody recognizes the benefits of his suffering, and where all the connections he made as an adult have been totally reset. A bittersweet ending, to say the least. Ocarina of Time is truly impressive in the way that it can tell such an impactful story in so few words, and it's a work of art. However, to appreciate Ocarina of Time's storyline requires a bit of literary analysis, and I've gotten enough "it's not that deep, bro," and "the curtains were just blue" comments to know that people will need an example of a Zelda story that's not so subtle. In which case I would offer Twilight Princess, a game that is anything but subtle, and is nevertheless considered to be a great story. Twilight Princess is not so special to me as it is to others, so please allow me to hand the floor over to my good friend and fellow Sheikah Squad member Tyler Townsend to explain just what makes Twilight Princess such a special narrative.
For a game that heavily uses the structure of Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess is a game that's able to establish its own identity and create its own legacy through its excellent story and diverse cast of characters. Twilight Princess follows the traditional hero's journey storytelling approach, but it does so in a way that allows enough breathing room for other characters and ideas to take shape. More so than any other Zelda game, Twilight Princess lives and breathes its atmosphere. For better or worse, this game doubles down on its premise and says, "Yeah, I might be a little edgy. What about it?" Link in Twilight Princess starts his journey the same as a lot of other Zelda titles, as a normal, everyday kid thrust into a grand adventure to save the fate of Hyrule. And while you could say that isn't good storytelling due to its repetitiveness, Twilight Princess is extremely good at using call to action and motivating you to continue. The tutorial is often viewed as a thorn in most players' side, but I disagree. I think the beginning section of Twilight Princess gives the player a stronger connection to Ordon Village, and more importantly, the village children, which is then used to motivate you to search for them after they go missing, leading to the discovery of the Twilight Realm for Link. After entering the Twilight Realm, Link is suddenly transformed into a wolf and taken captive, where he later awakens and meets Midna. Midna is an integral part of what makes Twilight Princess such an incredible story. She has as much, if not more, importance than not only Zelda in this game, but Link as well. Midna is brash and arrogant in the early parts of Twilight Princess. She is only out to use Link to retrieve the Fused Shadows so that she can fight Zant and reclaim her kingdom. But over the course of getting all the Fused Shadows, Midna grows fond of Link and the two slowly become friends. But at this point in the game, after retrieving all the pieces of the Fused Shadow, and when things are looking their brightest, Zant attacks Midna and Link, nearly killing her by returning her to the light world in her normal form and permanently cursing Link to be a wolf. This is where the strongest call to action in the game occurs. Carrying Midna's dying body to Zelda in a last-ditch effort to save her life has so much emotional weight. The bond that you have cultivated with her about to be stripped away before your eyes. The pressure is put on the player, but you aren't equipped to take her there as a wolf, creating an anxiety-filled moment in this game where it truly feels like every second counts. After Zelda sacrifices herself to save Midna, you see the full scope of her character development and just how important Link is to her. She even acknowledges her own selfishness. Twilight Princess is filled with many moments like this. There's a real progression of characters due to the strife that they've faced. Earlier, I talked about the village children, and I think one of the best examples of real character development in Twilight Princess is Colin. Colin starts as a cowardly child, but after seeing how courageous Link has been in the face of adversity, he also starts to become more brave. So brave that he was willing to push Beth out of the way of King Bulblin's charge and found himself taken captive. And even after he's saved, he doesn't revert back to cowardice. He understands now that he needs to become stronger, not for the sake of himself, but to protect the others. Even with Zant being sidelined in the fourth quarter so that Ganondorf can take over as the primary villain, you get a great glimpse at who he really is. Zant is immature, and the facade of this cold, foreboding enemy withers away to show the real man behind the mask. Zant was merely a bystander Ganondorf manipulated to house his power, a power that Zant was desperate to obtain. In his eyes, he was a divine vessel for the power of his new god, a god that gave him the ability to achieve everything he wanted. Zant shows his true self when you confront him, and you see how childish he really is. He stomps and throws tantrums because he didn't get what he wanted. He was an easy target for Ganondorf because of his vulnerability and lust for power. His hatred towards Midna fueled his resentment and desire for control. But he was nothing before Ganondorf. Only after Ganondorf gave him power did Zant become a threat, and it gave Zant a new confidence to become the scary, menacing villain he was presented to be. But once you confront him and he sees that you are powerful enough to fight him, the intimidation tactic no longer exists and the immature child resurfaces. Even after his defeat, he still holds onto the ideologic scenario in which he can't lose because Ganondorf's power will resurrect him. Zant's character is one that can be defined by the brainwashing of Ganondorf and how the lust for power ultimately was his undoing. Twilight Princess is so good at character arcs that it completes one for a character that isn't even from this game. The tragedy of the Hero of Time and the Child timeline wouldn't have been something you would have even remotely thought about if the Hero Shade hadn't been introduced. To build upon the lore and history of a character as vital and important as the Hero of Time, and to do so in a way that shows a different side of him, is masterful storytelling. The Hero Shade is a regretful and sad character burdened with the knowledge of saving not one, but two kingdoms and the traumas that came along with it. But upon returning back to his time and place, he is not celebrated, and he has no purpose as a hero. He becomes an aimless spirit until he can pass on his skills and aid the rescue of Hyrule once more. Twilight Princess is an epic and leans into that philosophy by presenting grandiose set pieces and Herculean challenges. Every boss in this game only amplifies the story and makes it bigger. Each individual area a complementary environment to the stories being told there. Twilight Princess is a game that knows its identity and uses its story to build engaging character relationships while exploring numerous themes like oppression with the Twilight, cowardice with Princess Zelda giving up her kingdom, the corruption of absolute power with Ganondorf's influence on Zant. Every character in this game builds upon its theming and creates a world filled with interesting narratives that only benefit the greater story itself. Great characters make great stories, and Twilight Princess is able to utilize them in a way that only improves what was already a good story.
Thank you, Tyler. You rule as always. Twilight Princess is an example of a more traditionally cinematic and less subtle story being told in a more modern time. kind of modern, and it certainly reinforces the point that Zelda stories have been good regardless of the era, from the GameCube to the N64. But the thing is, Ocarina of Time isn't even the first Zelda game with an excellent story, despite being an N64 game in 1998. To get to the first Zelda game with a genuinely great story, you have to go back further like a half decade to 1993, with the release of Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. I honestly think it would be fair to say that Link's Awakening is the first game in the series to put serious effort into telling a story at all, or at least one that didn't require reading the manual to understand. And the incredible thing is that when I talk about Link's Awakening having a compelling narrative, I don't just mean compelling for a Game Boy game. I mean that it's genuinely compelling by its own merit. The fact that it's a Game Boy game just makes it all the more impressive. The story of Link's Awakening is turbulent, genuinely shocking, and an emotional ride. I think the original holds up well, and in many ways I think it has better vibes, but the remake was able to bring this touching story to an entirely new audience. Link's Awakening starts off strong with an opening that establishes a sense of mystery. No lore dumps, fortuitous dreams, or wake-up calls from the princess, just Link being swept at sea and drifting his way into Koholint Island. Koholint is oozing with charm, and it sinks its claws into you very quickly. The villagers are quirky and adorable. Especially Marin, the cute girl who finds you on the beach and brings you to recover at her house. Marin has the most lines of any NPC, but the entirety of her script could still be easily fit on both sides of a flashcard. Yet she is so endearing, her dialogue is so effective in its brevity, that it's difficult not to catch feels for her yourself, or at least understand why Link is able to. She's kind-hearted yet goofy, she's not afraid to razz Link a little bit and put pressure on him. Taking Marin out on a date is a highlight of the game for a lot of people. She's an incredible character, the girl of Link's dreams. The rest of the NPCs in the game are all wonderful as well, charming and likable. Link's Awakening succeeds in making you want to save Koholint, not because there's a princess at risk, but because you desperately want to protect these lovable goofballs, which is why it's so unsettling when these characters start to occasionally provide you with some strange, out-of-place dialogue, questioning their existence and pondering topics you would perhaps not expect random villagers in a video game to broach. Killing bosses feels good at first, the same way it does in any Zelda game, but what's up with this post-battle dialogue? It's tough to feel good about killing a boss who tells you that they don't want to die. And the more of them you kill, the stranger the dialogue gets, and you start to feel like something's up. Who's the real villain here? Is there some sort of conspiracy? Then you finally enter the ancient ruins and the horrifying truth is revealed. This island, Koholint, and all the lovely people who occupy it, Marin, they're all simply part of a dream being had by the windfish who's locked in an eternal sleep. The nightmares are keeping him sleeping against his will. If he's woken up, everything here will disappear. All of it. What an absolutely crazy moral implication to heave onto the player, especially for a dang Game Boy game. The villains are not fighting for a traditionally evil purpose like conquering the kingdom. Well, I suppose in a way that's what they're trying to do, but they're trying to do it for the sake of preventing the dream from ending. They just don't want to die. Really, they're only fighting to stay alive, and who can blame them for that? The gnarliest part is that this reveal is given to you about 2/3 of the way through the game, not at the end. So you have to spend the entire last quarter of Link's Awakening interacting with these characters you love, knowing what fate awaits them, and defeating the last 2 dungeons with the knowledge that every puzzle you solve and every door you unlock brings you closer to Koholint's oblivion. Most interesting of all, the game itself has very little interest in allowing Link to be a self-insert in regards to this. Link is surprisingly vocal in Link's Awakening, using frequent and flavorful item descriptions and a single piece of short but extremely descriptive dialogue. Between the words uttered directly by Link and the way that certain NPCs describe him as appearing, we can clearly tell that Link is struggling to process this information. Though it isn't canon, the excellent Link's Awakening manga heavily builds on this moral dilemma, with Link genuinely debating the idea of simply giving up his quest. But ultimately in both the manga and the game, Link decides to do the right thing and wake up the windfish. After all, these are just figments of the windfish's imagination, whereas the windfish is an actual living creature, so surely he deserves the right to wake up and continue his life. But that doesn't make it easier as you interact with the villagers of Koholint, who seem to be cluing in more and more as time goes on that something's up. When you reach the end of the game, the 8th instrument gathered and the nightmare defeated, the Ballad of the Windfish is played. There is no triumph, no celebration. It doesn't feel good to conquer the shadow and awaken the windfish, to watch the lands of Koholint fade away and the characters you've grown to love disappear. It feels particularly awful when the camera chooses to linger on Marin longer than any other character, softly singing the very song that leads to her eradication, as she ever so slowly fades away and out of Link's life. The girl of his dreams indeed. And when Link awakens, not on the beach of Koholint, but on a piece of ship floating in the ocean, he's left with questions to ponder, as is the player. Would it have been so bad for Link to have left that final dungeon unconquered, to live the rest of his days in happiness among the wonderful people of Koholint? Doesn't he deserve that after all of his troubles? But on the other side, is it not true that the windfish, a real being, deserves to continue his life, even at the expense of these dream beings who aren't real? Then again, what does it mean to be real? It draws on the final thoughts left with Link by the windfish.
Verily it be the nature of dreams to end. When I dust awaken, Koholint will be gone. Only the memory of this dreamland will exist in the waking world. Someday, thou may recall this island. That memory makes the dream world real.
As Link sees the windfish soar by overhead, he does remember that dream. And as long as Link clings to that memory of his time on Koholint, of Marin, they're not gone. They live with him. And you know, the wildest thing is that as much as it might seem like I played a lot of this up, I really didn't. I might have narrated it a little dramatically, but this is just straight up the story of this really old Game Boy game. It rules. It's a surrealist Lynchian masterpiece all the way back in 1993. So you'll have to excuse me if I think you can get out of town with the idea that Zelda games have always had a bad story, if the series has been telling incredible and subversive tales since 1993. Let's talk about something a little bit more modern though. I brought on the incredible Wiz Catches Lightning to give some thoughts on what makes the story of Skyward Sword, the newest game we'll be talking about, so great.
Skyward Sword shakes up the status quo quite a bit, and not just because you had to get good at motion and gyro controls. No. Back in 2011, this game was the zeitgeist for the franchise. The story follows the Zelda formula, while also breaking the tried and true conventions of its blueprint. The usual suspects are here, Zelda and Link, but now there's a personal connection between the two that doesn't feel performative. Additionally, Zelda drops all previous tropes to even partake in her own journey, filled with self-discovery and heroic deeds. And time travel. Because, come on, it's Zelda. As a player, I don't feel like the two are just saving Hyrule because it's business as usual. No, get that out of your head. Hyrule doesn't even exist yet. That's right. There's world building too. The setting of Skyward Sword follows an Exodus event of what are considered to be some of the last Hylians alive, the goddess Hylia's chosen people, as she lifted landmasses into the sky in order to spare them from the wrath of an entity known only as the Demon King and his demon tribe. This introduces the hybridized Start and Continue to Explore Skyloft and its surrounding sky islands, a floating geographical wonderland chock full of mysteries, exploration, and the occasional goofy character. Skyward Sword has one of the better prologues of the Zelda series, and in my humble opinion, it's rivaled only by the prologue of Wind Waker. The prologue provides a riveting exposition to not only its time and place, but to the entire chronology of the Zelda series up until the game's release. And as someone who was knee-deep in Zelda forums on a library computer back in the day, I couldn't help but guffaw with excitement at the game's narrative when I first sat down and played. Back to these two. Boy likes girl. Girl likes boy. Boy has had everything in his life come easy to the point that he's known by his community as gifted. Insert local bully Groose to point this out. Groose is saying what most of Link's peers are thinking. This plucky youth is just so gosh darn talented that it makes him seem anything but bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. There's this sailcloth challenge all young men of Skyloft must partake in as a sort of ritual. They have to mount indigenous birds called loftwings, the same birds who adorn the classic Hylian crest most seasoned players are familiar with, while surmounting each other in a chase for an idol with the same namesake of their feathery companions. The winner of this contest gets to partake in a sacred ritual with the lass whom the games are named after. Spoiler alert, Link wins. He then gets to participate in this anciently rehearsed rite with his childhood crush, where it is then revealed that this ceremony is a sort of reenacted play, meant to convey a story that has been long passed down from Hylian to Hylian, about how the goddess gave a sailcloth to her chosen hero. After this, the two partake in a rather leisurely soar of what yours truly hoped to be some innocent romance that was cut all too short by a seemingly random cyclone of terror. Zelda is conventionally pillaged out of thin air, and now it's up to Link to pick up the pieces. This leads him to the first of two MacGuffins of the series, the Master Sword. Except, well, it's not the Master Sword. Not yet. This is chronologically the first Zelda game, which means that Link encounters what is known as the Goddess White Sword, a blade that was crafted to be the bane of all demons, and imbued with a spirit. Longtime players with keen observational skills and decent memories, or resourceful internet search engine skills, would remember that the Master Sword was described as the blade which chooses its wielder, leading many people back in the day to theorize that it had a soul. Well, it did have a soul, and her name is Fi. Fi, like her forebears before her, fulfills the preconceived roles of dialogue initiator to complement a Kanan-silent protagonist. She acts as the player's guide, and if we're talking about the Wii version of the game, she's the purveyor of annoyance on par with the likes of Navi. But she also provides some excellent insight, tantamount to the best history teacher you've ever had. Her debut alone is practically a jaw-dropping meta-commentary from the series to its fans that breaks the fourth wall splendidly, when she discusses the practice of oral tradition and how this practice is flawed. You see, her commentary acknowledges that the Hylians and their peripheral understanding of the land which they live in is not the most reliable form of narration for the player, and this in turn makes the player question the entire Zelda timeline. If it's called The Legend of Zelda, how much truth can we ascribe to that term, given its definition? If you choose to use Fi's divination skills, she will reveal tidbits to you about people, places, and things that appeared to have existed long before we ever met this game's hero. There are mentions of an ancient hero who existed before Link, like the excerpt we see when she mentions the shield hero. Fi also has definitive knowledge about the monsters which Link encounters along his journey, even providing knowledge of the big bad of the series, Demise. Fi's lore encourages the player to explore beyond the play for the next cutscene rigmarole, inviting the player to look more deeply beyond what is being presented at the surface level. A good example of this would be the 6 sage symbols located atop the dome of the sealed temple, given that there aren't any sages mentioned in Skyward Sword whatsoever. So Link has to find Zelda. Typical. But Link isn't rescuing Zelda. Instead, he's chasing her. Zelda is on her own mission. She's racing to purify herself at various in-world locations so that she can accomplish a task that isn't revealed to Link until 6 dungeons deep into the game, realizing who she is. It is only at this point in the game when the mysterious knots of this plot thread finally begin to unravel. You see, we learn that Zelda is not just the matriarchal, shrine maiden caricature she's been in previous games. She's actually the reincarnation of the goddess Hylia. Hylia, knowing she could not defeat the Demon King without the Triforce, sacrificed her divinity to become mortal, because the caveat of the Triforce is that divine beings can't use it. So, in order to be able to use this Deus Ex Machina device, the goddess had to abandon her Deus. And somehow, the goddess sitting at the edge of time knew that Link would also be around. So she laid out a plan to have him forge her greatest weapon in the event that he would need to defeat this Demon King should she fail to succeed at her initial plan. Which brings us to our next point. This game has not one, but two villains, and neither of them are named Ganondorf. The most recurring villain, which we see throughout the game, is Girahim, and he is excellent. You find out that he was the one who summoned the tumultuous tornado that parted Link and Zelda at the beginning of the game. Furthermore, he is pursuing Zelda at the same rate Link is, in order to steal her for his own ploys. He's easily one of the most difficult Zelda bosses of all time, if not the hardest Zelda boss ever, which makes him even more effective as a villain, as he can taunt you for your lack of skill if you're careless or not determined. In this way, gameplay shapes an effective story for what Girahim brings to its table, as the challenge of facing him supports further exposition to the tenacity of the lord he serves. It's kind of like, if you think I'm a challenge, you don't know the destruction my master is capable of, and that's just excellent anticipation building. Girahim's motivation is simple. He wants to bring back the demon tribe to its former glory. How does he plan on accomplishing this goal? Well, by serving Zelda's soul up on a platter to the imprisoned, which is a shell of what the Demon King once was. It is when Girahim succeeds at his goal that the player gets to look beneath the veneer of what he really is. Girahim is the sword of evil. For almost all of Skyward Sword's entirety, you, the player, were challenged by the antithesis of Fi. Girahim succeeds at bringing back his master, Demise. Demise is not Ganondorf, but the similarities are uncanny. The Demon King knew of Hylia and what she used to look like, which makes you think, what else does this guy know that he's not telling us? Fi states that Demise appears differently depending on the individual who sees him and the era he is currently occupying, which gives him just this ominous presence. And his motivation for absolute power is more so out of hatred and resentment for the gods. The why for this motivation is not only speculative to one's imagination, it actually sows a seed of doubt in the player's mind about the morality of Hylia. Like, why did she only save the Hylians from damnation? And if she has the characteristics of a deity, then why isn't she omniscient enough to thwart her archenemy, as well as omnipotent enough to prevent his return? When Demise is finally defeated, he places a curse meant to follow the blood of the goddess and the spirit of the hero. It is this curse that is rooted in Demise's hatred that will later form the incarnation of Ganondorf. So, although this was the most recent Zelda game back in 2011, it provided the entire reason for why there even was a Zelda timeline in the first place. And that to me was super neat. The story of Skyward Sword is one of imperfect predestination. Hylia sets a plan in motion to thwart the Conqueror of Time. That plan involves a cycle that is millennia old. The player gets to realize the culmination of this plan by being the hero who puts an end to the machinations of the primary and secondary antagonists. When one considers the full story of Skyward Sword, they aren't left with concrete answers. These answers could possibly aid in defining the entire series of Zelda games. Instead, the story's ending begs you to question things, leaving a lot open to interpretation. And that, to me, isn't just good storytelling. It's great storytelling. I feel like I could talk your ears off about why I love this game and how its story stands out, but this isn't my video. So let's send it on back to Nehru for more.
That man makes some seriously amazing content. Go check him out. So Skyward Sword is a great example of a Zelda narrative, as are all the games mentioned in this video, but I don't think any of them are the best. I said in the beginning of the video that I don't just think that Zelda games have good stories by video game standards. I also said that I think one game in particular has an incredible story that transcends the medium, and it's time we talk about one of the best stories ever told by a video game, period. Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask is a masterpiece, a work of art, and that's not a daring assertion. I likely could have only included Majora's Mask in this video, and it would have been a strong enough case study to prove my point. It eschews the hero's journey entirely, while embracing the subtle storytelling of Ocarina of Time and the surrealist nature of Link's Awakening, while introducing a psychological aspect rarely seen outside of horror games. It leaves us a game with a narrative that is tightly paced and traditionally satisfying, while also being haunting, melancholic, and thought-provoking. The actual plot for Majora's Mask is pretty compelling. A battle-scarred hero is sent back in time to reclaim the youth that was stolen from him, only to arrive and realize that the world has no idea who he is. All the connections he made as an adult are gone, and nobody knows the suffering he underwent. So, he goes in search of his best friend, Navi the fairy, but he doesn't find her. Instead, he is robbed by Skull Kid, and in pursuit to gain back his ocarina and horse, he's thrown into a pit that brings him to an alternate dimension, Termina, a world on the edge of apocalypse. Skull Kid, in his wrath and with the power of Majora, has put the moon on a crash course directly for Clocktown, and the only hope is to awaken the 4 giants in various corners of Termina, who will buy Link enough time to ascend to the moon and do battle with Skull Kid and Majora. He's aided in this by the Happy Mask Salesman, a Dionysian figure with unclear motives, but who is able to free Link from the Skull Kid's curse. Once all 4 giants are summoned, Link defeats Majora and Termina is saved. The people of Termina celebrate, well, most of them anyways, as Link silently returns to Hyrule, having saved another kingdom, but returning to the land where he faces the same problems as before. And, well, we all know how that turns out. Even this basic plot outline of Majora's Mask is unique and compelling, but it's in the fine details of the plot and in the themes of the game where the true magic is felt, and why Majora's Mask is such an important game for so many people. This can be perfectly encapsulated in the character of Majora, who is a refreshingly creative villain, partly as a result of being a villain that isn't Ganondorf, doesn't turn out to be working for Ganondorf, and is not in any way, shape, or form related to Ganondorf. While this isn't the only time or even the first time that this has happened in the series, villains like Bellum tend to come and go without much fanfare, whereas Majora has firmly ground herself a place in video game culture. Google Zelda tattoos and see how many Majora tattoos you see compared to Bellum or Vaati tattoos, or even Ganondorf tattoos for that matter. I think the success of Majora as a villain comes from a perfect mix of a strong visual design and excellent writing. She's like a floating heart mask that's really abstract and simple to remember while still being extremely cool and memorable. And on top of that, Majora is legitimately scary, I think more so than Ganondorf. Gani is a person and he can be killed like a person, even if he'll eventually come back. He monologues, he has moments of hubris, he shows occasional moments of humanity. Ganondorf is undeniably evil, but he's human. He can be understood. Majora is different. She's definitively inhuman, closer to a Lovecraftian deity than to a traditional Mad King villain archetype. There's an element to Majora that's sort of eldritch and unknowable. Her true motivations are never clearly delineated. She lives and dies in mystery, and this leaves the sense that the truth may have been beyond human comprehension. Majora is an enigmatic figure and a tremendously compelling villain. Equally compelling, but far more tragic, is the figure of Skull Kid, who is essentially the co-villain of Majora's Mask. Skull Kid is the definition of a complex villain. Skull Kid is an unsuspecting choice for a villain. He's functionally a child, and he served as a common enemy in Ocarina of Time, but it's precisely his unlikeliness and his childish demeanor that makes him such a captivating choice. He doesn't have full cognition, and he isn't fully capable of understanding the degree of harm that he's caused. He's a child, and children are prone to loneliness. This loneliness was originally filled by the 4 giants, his friends, but when they left, he was alone again, and he felt the stinging sensation of abandonment. His juvenile brain struggles to allow him to understand the duties of the 4 giants. It simply feels as though they've betrayed him. And what else are children prone to? Anger, throwing tantrums. The phrase lashing out like a child has real basis. When anger fills his heart, that anger attracts Majora, who draws him to her like Bilbo to the ring. Tattle and Tail had partly fulfilled this gap in friendship, but the anger was already in his heart for Majora to latch onto. Once he steals Majora from the Happy Mask salesman and adorns the mask, the terrible power of Majora fills every crevice of his mind, his hatred and anger amplified, turning this childlike figure into a wrathful and angry monster. His childlike tantrums, once so harmless, now have apocalyptic consequences. And this is the tragic dichotomy of Skull Kid. He is certainly in the wrong. A misbehaving child does need discipline, but Majora is the true villain, and one can't really blame the Skull Kid for actions he took while under her influence. Majora's Mask offers a powerful message of forgiveness at the end, when the four giants plead with Link to forgive their small friend. They understand that he did not have full autonomy under the control of Majora, and that he was simply lashing out. It was just a cry for help that was capitalized on by evil forces. While some people like Ganondorf and Majora cannot be forgiven, it is good to forgive when you can. A little grace can go a long way. The Skull Kid and Majora make beautiful examples of a nuanced and complicated villain. Aside from themes of forgiveness, Majora's Mask explores a lot of fertile territory. Majora's Mask is fundamentally a game about death, loss, grief, and how we process these events and feelings. You can find explorations of these concepts everywhere, from small moments to major plot points, and death is not a topic skirted over for the sake of maintaining an E for everybody rating. At the macro level, everybody in Clocktown is grappling with the sensation of incoming death. The moon is getting ever closer after all, and that fact is on everybody's minds. Aonuma mentioned that part of the inspiration for the moon apocalypse was the feeling that was brought on when North Korea had launched a missile over top Japan without permission, bringing on feelings that a missile could drop on them at any moment. Aonuma noticed the bizarre contradiction of feelings that came from attending something as cheery and full of life as a wedding, while that constant fear serves as a cloud hanging over everybody, trying your best to enjoy your life while this anxiety hangs over you. That sense of conflicted anxiety permeates all throughout Clocktown, as residents do their best to continue living their life while this sense of doom becomes more and more prevalent as the moon gets closer and closer. Some characters deny the truth even as it literally stares them in the face. Others are scared from the get-go, but the majority of citizens simply go about their lives. The moon very well may fall and crush them in a few days, and that's a scary thing to think about, but living in fear doesn't put food on the table for tomorrow. Things get intense in the evening of the final day, though, when it becomes hard to imagine tomorrow at all. When people want to tell me that the storytelling in Zelda is bad, I just want to point them to Romani Ranch, as Cremia is feeding alcohol to her younger sister to get her drunk, so the pain of being crushed to death will be less severe. Death is explored on an individual level quite frequently in Majora's Mask. Even one of the central gameplay elements, the use of transformation masks, is interlinked with death. Each mask comes from the soul of somebody recently departed. In the case of the Goron mask, we meet the spirit of Darmani after he's passed away. And in the case of the Zora mask, Link is present for Mikau's dying moments. The most haunting instance of death in all of Zelda comes from the Deku mask, the one instance in which we do not know the origin of the deceased who provided the mask. We are able to make a fairly educated guess, however, as when the game is completed and the credits scroll on, while the rest of Termina is celebrating, we find the Deku Butler crying at the feet of this withered husk of a tree with a face. Funny, he mentioned earlier that his son was missing. While the departed have to deal with the process of death itself, they leave behind the living to deal with the sense of loss that comes from this death, and that is explored often as well. The Deku Butler grieving over his murdered son, Lulu losing her voice over the trauma of believing that she's lost her children, the Goron village grappling with the loss of their leader. Death is a core part of the story of Majora's Mask, and so is the grief over that death by the living. But as much as Majora's Mask is a game about death and sorrow, it's also a game about healing. The Song of Healing allows this in gamified form, but it's accompanied by practical actions taken by Link to ease the hearts of the troubled, both dead and alive. These wounded souls are not just healed by Link's music, but also by his love and compassion. The anger of the Deku King is soothed by the return of his daughter. The distress of the Goron is healed by the soothing of Darmani's son. He brings Lulu's voice back to her by rescuing her children. He puts Darmani's soul to rest by assuring him that he'll take over from here. He allows Mikau a peaceful death by promising to take care of Lulu. He heals the tormented soul of the Skull Kid by defeating Majora and, more importantly, forgiving him. Every Zelda game sees Link improve the lives of individual people, but generally it comes about as a byproduct of his main quest. In Majora's Mask, helping people is the point. To go back to Skull Kid again, defeating Majora is only part of the equation. He truly heals his tormented soul by forgiving him, accepting his friendship. And I think there's some small truth to the idea that, in a way, this journey healed Link a little bit too. Majora's Mask is just an incredible game in general, but I think it's an exception to the rule in the sense that with Majora's Mask, I think the story really is the selling point. The gameplay is good, but the story is so thought-provoking and moving that it's the one game in the series I do play specifically for the story. I hope what I've said here today, alongside the thoughtful contributions from Tyler and Wiz, has been enough to convince you that the hot take going around right now is just that, a hot take. They come and go like wildfires, but I'm hoping in some small part to have prevented this one from burning down too many trees. Because Zelda games do have great stories, and that's a fact. There is the occasional stinker, for sure, and even the best Zelda narratives are often quite messy. The Zelda team loves messing with time travel, and they probably always will. And I don't think this behavior is ever going to change, but I also don't think that it overrides the truly incredible stuff that we can find in these games. And I do think there's a lot to criticize regarding the narratives of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But those are two games, and they're not representative of the entire series. The notion that the series at large tells poor stories is total nonsense. With scant few exceptions, they're always at least passable, often venture into greatness, and occasionally touch excellence. These stories are not afraid to explore complicated and adult themes, and they often do so with care and nuance. The Zelda team writes believable and lovable allies and hateable, scary villains. They might follow the hero's journey, but they're not afraid to subvert it, and a lot of criticism given to Tears of the Kingdom simply comes from the story being too ambitious. Zelda games do not have bad stories, and it's very silly to say so. I understand wanting to defend Tears of the Kingdom, but please do it without dragging the rest of the series down, because it isn't worth it. Thanks for watching. I know it was a bit of a long video, but this has been really eating away at me and it feels good to get it out. As always, if you'd like to support me, you can do so by liking or commenting or sharing the video. Come follow me on Twitter. If you'd like to support directly, you can come join the Subrosian Parade over on Patreon. Be sure to go check out Tyler and Wiz, they make amazing stuff. And hey, be careful out there because it's dangerous to go alone.